Just to sort of kick off this part of the presentation, can I just ask, as designers, which of you are designing houses which are what I'll call code plus as far as energy efficiency in housing is concerned, so H1, more than H1? So it's quite a few, okay. Pleasing to see. Let me just tell you a little story. Some years ago, or for many years, my family and I have hosted international students under the AFS program, if anybody of you are familiar with that. And over the years, we've had students, high school students, teenage students, as I said, from all sorts of climates. Back in '98, we had two students. One was from Sweden and one was from Greenland. She was an Inuit. Now, she lived in a house we had at that time, which was in Kingsland. It was an old bungalow, minimally insulated. And I can tell you that she found the New Zealand climate cold. Now, this is an Inuit. No joking matter, because she came to New Zealand. Inuits, if you may or may not be aware, don't have a lot of body hair. By the time she went back to Greenland, she was starting to grow hair on her arms, and she was absolutely horrified. So it just goes to show you that we do have to be very careful about how we design and build our homes or renovate our homes. There's been a lot of uncertainty, hasn't there, in recent years in terms of what constitutes a green building design or a home. And I suppose that this tool, in my view, is one of those that's going to allow us to bring some groundedness to design and building homes which are warm and comfortable and healthy for future generations. And it's certainly great to see the level of collaboration, as Nick touched on, across all sectors of the industry and beyond the building industry as well, to develop these tools. You won't be offended if you haven't been consulted so far, I'm sure, but I know that some of your colleagues have been and have been very much involved with the testing of the tool. In a recent survey of your colleagues, designer colleagues in the US, 15% of them said that between 25 to 49% of their revenues were now being generated with sustainable building projects. So that's a big chunk. If I was to go back probably 10 years, even in New Zealand, it would be a very, very small percentage of buildings that would have any significant sustainable design elements to them. As I said, we're quite blessed with having a focus on a non-mandatory or voluntary tool, which the industry's input and developed. Let's be quite clear, there's been an enormous amount of voluntary work go into the tool, and while some of you may be very, very frustrated about the tenure that it's taken to get where we are now, I'd like to think that that's been because of the voluntary nature of it and to make sure that the right people are engaged in the development process. We're very keen to see it into the market as quickly as possible, probably more impatient than you are. But the simple reality is that we have to walk a little bit before we can run, and we're very keen to see the tool in the market and being used, and for you then to individually and collectively input into its ongoing development. That's going to be the critical part, to benefit our entire industry. In terms of green building, and this is my whimsical look at it, in terms of green walls particularly, there are key elements to it, but I just wanted to very quickly touch on where plasterboard sits. And I take the comments that were coming from the floor in terms of, the commercial bias in its development. But let's be quite clear that Winstones and some of my team have quite significant depth of knowledge around building science, and we have attempted to apply that knowledge collaboratively with other parts of the team that have been developing this tool. But just in terms of plasterboard itself, I think it's useful just to have a look at it in the context of the nature of the material. So this is a little bit of a backward look at materials per se, building materials, to give you some insights as to how you as designers can look at materials. And I can only talk with some knowledge around this one, even though I have a background in many other building materials. But gypsum is one of the two key raw materials for plasterboard, and it's one of the most common minerals in the world. It forms a very, very small component in all seawater. And what we have is very, very large evaporated lakes going back millenniums. And we get our gypsum out of South Australia, where there's very, very large surface lakes, as you can see in the top right-hand corner there. Very, very little foliage, and they literally scrape the gypsum off the surface. In Western Australia, they also have large deposits. Not that we draw on them. Most of that material goes up to Japan, and it's a huge lake up there near Dampier, if you've ever been up that way. It's a very hot and dry area. It's a coast near the coast, this lake, and it's about 145 kilometres long by about 45 kilometres wide, and there's a 3 metre deep vein of gypsum. It's been speculated that there's several hundred, if not thousands, of years of resource there. But the point to be taken, of course, when we look at this from a raw materials perspective is it's a non-renewable resource. Unless somewhere around the world there's going to be another seawater lake that evaporates, it's not going to be economically viable to think of it as a renewable material. So we have to look very, very carefully at how we use the material here in our production. And we certainly do take great pride in having a look at beyond the grave, so to speak. In other words, to look at what we can do to make sure that the material is managed in a responsible manner. 4 of the 5 gypsum plant manufacturers in Australasia also buy their gypsum from South Australian source. The last one does manufacture in Western Australia, and they buy from the West Australian source. The second key raw material is paper. You're aware that, of course, that is a renewable material. However, we specify that it is 100% recycled material, so it's at least on its second cycle after. So we're not using or chopping down trees. In fact, we allow for up to 4 recycles in terms of the production of our paper before we then have to look at bringing in a lower level of recycled material into its manufacture. Because basically with every time you recycle, you're losing some of the glue, some of the natural lignins in it to hold the paper together. So it becomes effectively less useful. In terms of gypsum itself, the reason I'm talking about this is that I'm going to talk about waste and where it goes to in a minute. But agricultural gypsum is very, very widely used in New Zealand. There's tens of thousands of tonnes of it used in horticultural and agricultural purposes. For those of you who like wine, it's very widely used in the wine industry as a soil conditioner, particularly in those areas that have clay soils, because basically it reacts with the aluminium and magnesium content in the clay and allows for better drainage and root penetration of the vines. And I particularly like that, the little bit of flavour that I like to think it adds to it as well, but who knows. It's also used in beer, for those who like a touch of beer in the production. I'm not quite sure what it does, but most of the beer manufacturers here and overseas use a very small proportion of gypsum in its production as well. I suspect it's to do with clarification. The bag on the right-hand side there is the branded material that we're producing, which you will find for your own home use in your garden, and marketing people have come up with the wonderful brand name of gypsum after great consideration. But if you see that gypsum brand in the home gardening shops and the large retail centres, then that's the stuff that we bring in from Australia.